Welcome to this review of Elder Scrolls Skyrim. Here we'll be looking at a few impressions, a little bit about the story, some aspects like exploration, combat, and progress, some of the pros and cons in this review. So to begin with, just on initial impressions, I've spent about 60 hours with Skyrim so far. And it's just that there's so much to this game. The scale is just really broad. So you have countless quests and NPCs in the world to interact with. You have all these many stories packed into one game. Every NPC has unique dialogue lines, which would have no doubt taken an incredible effort on behalf of the development team. There are also a lot of little systems packed into Skyrim. So you have your ability to forge weapons and armor, you can craft foods and potions, you can pickpocket, you can chase bounties in the world, you mine for resources, you can trade with NPCs in the world, and you can upgrade your skills by talking to certain NPCs dedicated to those skills. You can even buy houses and attain titles in town. It's just so many little systems packed into this one game that you never lack for anything interesting and new to do. The story is good. It was never really my primary concern when I played through Skyrim, but it does give you something to work towards. So the very general outline is that you are known as a Dragonborn, which means you have a special gift, namely to speak the language of dragons via special shouts. You also want to discover why the dragons are arising from the dead, which is where your journey begins, and you uncover that mystery the longer you play. To speak a bit about exploration, this to me is by far the strongest part to Skyrim. It's just amazing how organic the world feels, and like how organically you come across new creatures in the world. You uncover new sites like dungeons, mines, and caves. There's just so much in Skyrim that takes place underground, below the surface, and often quests will take you there. There's also just so much to explore. There are forests, marshes, there are coasts, villages, towns, mountains, various monuments, shrines, coves, and just so much more waiting for the player to uncover. There are also many bosses in this game, ranging from humanoid-like enemies to creatures, all of which, when you come across, will test your ability, some more so than others. But there's always something new. There's always something new to discover and something new to fight. The world just also feels so dynamic. So it's not uncommon to come across enemy factions fighting each other in the world, or coming across a corpse on a road, which just speaks to some tragic event that happened there before you arrived. It all just communicates story. The combat is certainly, I believe, acceptable. Some have criticized it for its simpleness and lack of tactical strategy. So they say that it's basically just swinging your weapon until your enemy drops down dead. And there's some truth to that, but this didn't really get in the way of my experience. I think on the good side, combat feels very crunchy. So when you hit an enemy with, say, your warhammer, you really feel that blow. It really feels like you're knocking the lights out of some unfortunate victim. And regarding weapons, there are dozens of weapons across the world to use. These range from heavy and light weapons to bows and all in between. And as noted already, weapons and armor are upgradable as long as you have the required perks and the required resources to do so. To speak a bit about progress, Skyrim has a very extensive skill tree that is itself broken down into quite a number of categories. So, for example, you have a category for archery, for blocking, for conjuration, or a category for heavy armor, for double hand weapon usage, and so on. Each of these skills upgrade the more you use them. So the more you use double-handed weapons, the more that skill will upgrade. The more you use your archer, the more that will upgrade, and so on. And each of these upgrading of these smaller skill trees sort of contribute to upgrading your main character. And every time you upgrade your main character through levels, you're provided with skill points that can be used on the skill trees. So in reality, I think Skyrim has a very strong progression curve when it comes to skill upgrades. Also very strong for Skyrim is the modding community. The modding community is pretty enormous. You get through the modding community, you can get new quests and storylines that really exercise fidelity with Skyrim's overall lore, to the extent that if you didn't know they were mods, you wouldn't realize that they were mods in the first place. They're mods for visual and textual and environmental upgrades. You get armor and weapon mods. There's even a standalone game mod that was just released for free on Steam for those who are interested. But of course, like all games, Skyrim's not perfect. There are some areas which do betray age and which could have been designed a bit better. So one would be the user interface. It's every time you want to use something like a magic power or to use a potion or equip a weapon, you sort of got to open up a menu, and these menus feel quite clunky, and it feels like it slows combat down a bit and can feel like it takes you out of the immersion a bit. Graphics also tend to betray Skyrim's age. As we know, Skyrim's several years old now, and often, for example, environmental objects have a blocky-like appearance, for example. And NPCs, often their faces lack details that we would sort of expect to find in more modern titles. NPCs also lack sort of bodily gestures and often just look like heads speaking. So like there's no real animation to their bodies when you engage them. Skyrim has its fair share of bugs. I had 1 or 2 crashes in my playthrough, and there are certain areas in the game, especially in more populated areas, where the frame rate does dip quite significantly. But this was never too bad that it took away from my overall experience. Also, somewhat problematic is the AI. So the artificial intelligence of especially some enemies in the game are quite easy to exploit, especially which can come in use for the player when you come up against some really tough enemies, especially bosses. So, for example, one exploit is that if you can't face an enemy on the field hand to hand, you can sort of position yourself on a ledge and just use your bow and arrow to knock him over, for example. The AI also occasionally gets stuck on the environmental objects from time to time, which can break immersion. Also provided for players are companions. So you have an AI companion whom you can hire in the world to journey with you. And they're very useful, but they can also be very annoying, especially when they get in the way, like in between doors and small corridors, and you sort of struggle to make your way past them. I think also one of the major selling points of Skyrim is the fact that you can come up against dragons and fight dragons, and that is very interesting, especially at the start when it's rather exciting, but after a dozen or so times it starts to drag and you start to want to avoid fighting dragons because it just feels like a chore. But although Skyrim's not perfect, none of these problems really destroyed my experience. And I think overall Skyrim is a very good game. It took a lot of effort to put together. It's intricate, it's got all these little systems, all these systems that come together to provide one very unique experience of an open world setting. I think if you let yourself become absorbed into the atmosphere Skyrim offers, I think you're going to be spending many, many hours playing through to the end. I can definitely recommend it.